Welcome to the Headache Doctor Podcast, where it's our mission to educate and empower everyone with headaches and migraines so that you can break free from a life of fear of your next headache or migraine and dependence on medication, allowing you to thrive in everything you do. All right. Well, Kelli, welcome to the Headache Doctor Podcast. I'm so glad you're here. I think we're going to have a fantastic discussion. You are a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and so thanks so much for being on the show.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
So we always start off with just giving context for who you are and how you got into this migraine and helping people with migraines. What's your story? How'd you get here?
Yeah, so I am someone who has migraine myself. I've had it as far back as I can remember in childhood. It's something I struggled with. Both my parents have migraines, so it's definitely something that's been a large part of my life. And as I, got older, I started doing my own research, as a lot of us who have migraine do. And I just wasn't happy with what my doctors were offering to me. And I was excited about what I was finding in research and just felt like it wasn't being talked about enough. So I decided to specialize in it as I came out of my internship to become a dietitian. And here we are.
Yeah, you said you piqued my interest when you said there were things within the research that were exciting. Can you give us a high-level view of what that was?
Yeah, so the first things that I came across were really the connection between gut health and migraine, and that, gut-brain connection. That really just lit me up, and how even just seemingly simple things like adding fiber to your diet can help with migraine really just got me excited. And that's still something that informs a lot of the work that I do with my clients to this day. We talk about gut health a lot.
Yeah, I love it. So one thing we ask nearly all of our guests on this podcast is what area of our healthcare system did you see a gap in? I mean, you spoke to this just in your personal experience, but speak to it to the person listening to this that's been frustrated with finding real answers and objective things outside of medication that they can utilize. What are some gaps in our healthcare system, and how do you explain those?
Yeah, so I think where a big gap lies, and it's sometimes my response to this is, well, a holistic approach needs to be taken more. Like, that needs to be something that's offered to patients with migraine because it works so well. But I think where maybe the solution lies is just making sure that referrals are made more often to people like dietitians and physical therapists and, allied healthcare professionals who can really round out a patient's treatment team. Because migraine, for most people, I would say, isn't a condition where just a doctor on their own can help you really find long-term relief. It requires a team. So I think, helping people make referrals and spreading awareness about the different, allies that can help someone with migraine is really something that's missing right now.
Yeah, on that same line of thinking, do you in your profession as a dietitian, do you feel dietitians understand what is needed in order to care for someone that has this diagnosis?
That's another thing that I think needs work. Even just the awareness that this is an area we can focus on as dietitians. I think when I was kind of deciding if this is what I wanted to do, I came across one other dietitian who did this. And that's another thing that made me want to specialize in migraine because, again, it was something that was needed. So I think even just a conversation around, as a place to start, chronic pain and how we can help with that, and then even narrowing it down to migraine itself is something that needs to be added to our curriculum because I am self-taught. I had to pursue this knowledge. It did not come from my schooling. So,
yeah, we hear that a lot. Most of the professionals that I interview have paved their own way into this. And so their education in whatever respective field didn't necessarily equip them to feel confident helping someone with migraine. And so it falls, really the trickle-down effect is someone who's suffering, chronic pain in general as well is not, it's kind of overlooked. And so let's talk about I talk a lot about the mechanical impact. So when I say mechanical, I'm talking about the neck and how we move and how our body functions and how we restore that and the implications of pain. We've had functional medicine providers on this podcast that talk about diet, naturopathic providers. And I think, honestly, you're the first dietitian. And so I'm excited to go down this road of diet and how it connects to migraine. Can you give us a high-level understanding of, like, someone that's experiencing head pain, why should they care about their diet?
Yeah, so food and nutrition is just important to us as humans, right? Like we need calories, protein, fat, carbs, vitamins, minerals just to function. And then adding migraine on top of that, it becomes even more important to make sure that we're considering nutrition and at the same time not making nutrition and food a source of stress, because that's not going to help either. But food and nutrition is linked with things that make migraine more difficult to manage, like micronutrient deficiencies, like gut health imbalances, like hormonal issues. Nutrition is involved in all of that. So that's why it's important to consider food, not only as a human, but as a human with migraine.
Yeah, so when we're thinking about diet in general and culturally, the diet that whether it's like Western culture, I know like food looks very different in different cultures, but maybe let's talk about like Western culture and the diet that we have. What are some of the issues that you're seeing, and then more specifically, how are those things impacting someone that is experiencing migraine?
So I think in general, our diet, our Western diet lends itself to inflammation. But there are some benefits to the Western diet, which I know is like, excuse me, but we do have a lot of opportunities within that diet to make life easier as people with migraine, because
Okay.
honestly, the place I see people with migraine struggle the most when it comes to nutrition, at least people who end up, working with me, is that they're struggling to eat at all because of their symptoms affecting their day-to-day life so much. They're
Sure.
struggling with being able to spend time in the kitchen to actually prepare food. So pulling from some of the convenience that we get as a benefit from a Western diet, we have a lot of prepared foods available to us, a lot of like prepackaged and prepped things available already that make life easier, and kind of mixing that with what we know is maybe more of a health promoting way of eating, like getting lots of diversity of plant foods, getting, plenty of good quality proteins and fats in the diet. We can marry those two ideas and make it so that we can eat a nutrient dense, health promoting diet, but in a way that's actually doable for someone struggling with a chronic condition like this.
Yeah, I love that perspective, because if we're just going to eat raw foods, there's work that's involved in that, and so
Yeah.
you're seeing in your own clients a need for just kind of the prepackaged, easy. Let's just consume something. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, well, and that's a good place to start for a lot of people. Like if you're eating one meal a day and you're struggling with blood sugar issues and you're having trouble hydrating, like let's just eat something. Like that's what I'll say to a lot of my clients first. Like I want you to eat something. That's our starting point. And then we can add in some like health, nutrient dense things, and we can look more at like, let's try a new plant food this week and things like that. But I really try to encourage people to look at where you're starting from and make little baby steps. We're not trying to go from eating, cereal in the morning and that's it for the day, and then all of a sudden you're eating this perfect diet tomorrow. Like it's just
Right.
not going to work. So taking baby steps and getting to the point where your diet eventually looks pretty good and is also sustainable for you, like that's what we want.
Yeah, I love that. Baby steps.
Mm-hmm.
So when you mentioned that the Western diet does cater to inflammation, flesh that out for us. What does that mean? What are some of the foods that are in your head when you say cater to inflammation?
So it's really more of the balance. So
Okay.
if we think about like omega-3s versus omega-6s, right? A lot of people, and I see this in blood work that I run, a lot of people have an imbalance of those things. So omega-3s come from like fatty fish. That's the easiest source for a lot of people. Omega-6s come from a lot of like processed oils and snack foods and things like that. So it's not that we don't want any omega-6s. We want a healthy balance. So that's where I think the diet, the Western diet kind of does us a disservice, is if we don't have a balance, if we don't consider adding in some of those fresh foods, plant foods, high quality proteins, then the other stuff, the like fun foods that are okay to eat in moderation, they kind of sway that balance and lead to an inflammatory state of having like too much omega-6 and not enough omega-3s. So that would be one example of how it can contribute to inflammation like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this moderation, balance. This sounds like, for listeners, you're going to provide them with something reasonable that caters to them. Yeah,
that's my goal.
Yeah, I love it. So it sounds like you have a lot of people that are struggling just to like get the calories, like their migraine that day is lending them to in bed. They're kind of debilitated, and that happens frequently. Am I understanding that?
Yeah, that is what a lot of my clients look like when they get to me. Yeah.
Okay. So that client, the recommendation is let's just start eating something. Let's increase your caloric intake so that you're not starving yourself. Your glucose levels are at a more regular level, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. Let's take the opposite example. Someone who is able to have 3 meals a day plus. Maybe they're not restricted as far as that the debilitating migraine isn't keeping them from eating. What are some things that they should consider?
So I've talked a little bit about diversity here and there, but that's typically the first thing I recommend. I think a lot of us, even those of us who feel like we eat a pretty healthy diet, could stand to increase diversity. And the reason I harp on this so much is because it's really important for getting all of the different vitamins and minerals that we need and different antioxidants to have a diversity of our diet, specifically plant foods is what I'm talking about here. But it's also really important for our gut health, because we know that different phytochemicals, so different natural chemicals found in plants, feed different types of bacteria in our gut. And we want these bacteria there. They do lots of good beneficial things for us. So we need that diversity of foods to have a diverse population of bacteria in our gut. And that can translate in an easier to manage migraine and less micronutrient deficiencies, which are pretty darn common. So that is one place where I would start. Even if you're someone who feels like you have a pretty healthy diet, try to choose some new plant foods.
Yeah. Okay. So generally people are going to be somewhat deficient, or maybe they can bolster up their plant food side of their diet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So as far as like, before we jumped on the call, you mentioned diets, triggers. Those are not necessarily things that you recommend, and that really piqued my interest. So I want you to talk about that, because my question was, is there a diet that we can Google, that we can subscribe to, that we can go to Barnes & Nobles and buy the book that you would recommend? And if not, why?
Yes. So there certainly are diets that you can Google and buy the book for when it comes to migraine. I'll first say some people find these diets really beneficial, and that's awesome. Different things are going to work for different people with migraine, as I'm sure you've found. It's a very individual condition.
Yeah.
But what I've seen a lot, and actually experienced personally as someone with migraine, is that a lot of the diets that are recommended for migraine are very restrictive, and they can actually end up doing more harm than good, sometimes physically, sometimes mentally, and sometimes both. I see a lot of disordered eating in the migraine space. I see a lot of micronutrient deficiencies and things like that because of some overly restrictive diets. And it can also just lead to like fear around food, anxiety around food. This isn't good just for our relationship with food and our mental health, but it's also not good for migraine either. So that's why I tend to use or save these diets as like a last resort, because you really can get some good benefits from taking a holistic approach and thinking more about adding things into your diet rather than removing them. And I've seen great results in people who have done this, so it is totally possible.
Yeah, I love that. Again, it sounds like your MO is just let's create something specific to the person you're talking to that is reasonable. It's
Yeah.
something that, yeah, I love it. Let's talk about triggers.
Hmm.
Another hot topic within the migraine world is what are your food triggers? Let's avoid your food triggers. Talk to us about that, because it sounds like you talk frequently about that or have opinions on triggers and how we should think about them.
Yes. So food triggers are definitely a real thing. I would say, most people with migraine probably have one food trigger. There aren't, that I've seen and that, research can tell us, any real like universal migraine triggers when it comes to food, other than like maybe alcohol in excess, caffeine in excess. But what I hear time and time again from, people I work with and just people I talk with about migraine is that they really struggle to determine what their triggers are. And it's a real sticking point for them as far as making progress in their migraine. So, what I like to do for people in that situation, which is most people, they're struggling to figure this out, is to like take a step back from trying to decipher triggers for a little bit, because there are other things you can work on. And working on those other things and working to like raise your threshold for migraine so you're less susceptible to episodes can actually make it so triggers aren't quite as big of a deal anymore, and make it easier to determine what those triggers are in the first place. So if you're in the place where triggers are like just a nightmare and you can't figure them out and you're really frustrated about it, take a step back, let's table it, work on other stuff. It may not even be as big of a deal as you think it is.
Yeah, that actually sounds very in line with how we communicate. On this podcast, we talk a lot about threshold,
Yeah.
because all these systems in our body are having to function in unison and impacting our experience with pain. So let's talk about threshold. Let's talk about if it takes us down the road of inflammation, but talk about threshold and why that's important, how diet impacts threshold.
Yes. So threshold theory of migraine is my favorite way to approach migraine. It's behind all of the work that I do. I think it's a really nice way to approach it that is much more like patient friendly, because it's not putting the blame on you as much for like, oh, I ate a piece of chocolate and I have a migraine episode now and it's my fault. It's just not as straightforward as that. And I like to tell people that, we all have our, unique threshold for migraine, and we can raise that migraine, or that threshold, we can lower that threshold depending on a lot of different factors that we can get into. And the way that we cross over that threshold is by being exposed to different triggers. So it's rarely just one trigger that throws you over that threshold to experience a migraine episode. It's usually a buildup of a lot of things, whether it's food or stress or dehydration, or lack of sleep, whatever it may be. All of those things build up to make you cross over that threshold. So that's why I think it's nice to look at it this way, because you have so many opportunities to make improvements, and you can start in an area that feels more doable for you, rather than, trying to cut out all these foods or trying to, have the perfect diet or whatever it may be. We can take those baby steps and really chip away at that trigger load as a whole.
Yeah, that's great. So on this, continuing this conversation of triggers, elimination diets are they're commonly prescribed, they're known, and when we're trying to figure out what our trigger is, we just, it makes sense intuitively just to eliminate things, add them back in, see how your body responds. Most of what you've said is sort of let's add in. So talk to me about elimination diets. What is your approach there?
So I rarely do elimination diets or recommend elimination diets. And typically when I do recommend them, it's because it's someone who seems to have a lot of food sensitivities, rather than an issue with like migraine triggers, like, chocolate, red wine, cheese, that type of thing. So that's typically my approach. And even then, I still like to work from a root cause approach with food sensitivities because there's usually something causing those that we can work on.
Yeah.
So most of the people who end up working with me are not interested in restriction. So we work from that root cause approach and try to address the underlying issue. And a lot of times that makes it so we don't even have to do an elimination diet or food restrictions or things like that, unless there's a very obvious issue with a certain food. Like gluten intolerance and sensitivity is a very real thing, and some people can't handle dairy or they're lactose intolerant. So those are real and they're worth working with, but massive elimination diets and food restriction isn't always necessary, especially if you don't want to do it. You do not have to. It's just one approach.
Yeah. What about supplements? Oftentimes, we think about diet, we think about vitamins. Like, what, if any, do you recommend as far as supplements go?
Yes. So there are a handful of supplements that have been researched for migraine and their ability to help people with migraine. And, just as important, I've seen them in, real life work as well. So we want to take both into account. But, supplements like magnesium and CoQ10, riboflavin, those have been shown to be helpful for migraine for a lot of people. There are also other ones like vitamin D and omega-3, which we've talked about, that are just common deficiencies and imbalances that we see with people who have migraine. So it's also important to consider micronutrients like that, even if it's not like a widespread recommendation for everyone. And then you've also got to consider if you're someone who is currently struggling to eat a nutrient-dense diet, would you maybe benefit from a multivitamin while you're working on that to help make sure you're just covering all your bases? And then from there, it becomes much more personalized as far as, needs after that. But magnesium, CoQ10, riboflavin, that's kind of the trio that we say, for a lot of people can make a big difference.
Yeah, I love it. So give us an idea of if there's any, we just talked about something very practical, but are there any key takeaways? So I see a lot of trends in the patients that I see and the lens that I'm looking at them through. Give us some high-level trends that you see and things that people can take away, whether that's hey, here's a quick way to evaluate your own diet, to most people I work with need to make XYZ change, something like that.
Ooh, yeah. So two things come to mind that we haven't talked about that I think would be a really good place for a lot of people to start. And that would be optimizing hydration and protein.
Okay.
So hydration, the thing that I've probably seen make the most difference for the most amount of people, even people I'm not working with who just follow me on Instagram and try it, is adding electrolytes to their routine. I mean, that can make such a big difference just doing that daily. So whether it's, making your own little electrolyte concoction or, using one of the powdered electrolyte drinks out there, which we have so many options now, that can make a huge difference for a lot of people. And then just making sure that you're having plenty of protein at each meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and snacks if you can swing it. That can also make a huge difference, both by making sure that you're, just giving your body what it needs, but also helping to balance out blood sugar throughout the day. Protein's really good for that too. Yeah,
I love it. My wife is always throwing in protein when I reach for a carb. So
yes. Balance.
That's definitely practice in our household. I understand what you're saying, and I really your approach and what you've laid out, I think is very attractive and will be to our listeners. So that moderation, we talk about that in the context of movement a lot on our podcast. I mean, you don't need to be this fitness freak, but we do want people to move, and it sounds like and movement can look different depending on who you are. And so it sounds like a very similar process here.
Yeah.
I want people to know maybe a little bit of how you work with someone, and then also how they can interact with you and reach out to you. I know your Instagram has some really good content, but just give people context for who you are, and feel free to kind of promote what you're doing so that these people have another avenue outside of medication to help manage their symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always say the best place to start is my Instagram. I'm the Migraine Dietitian. If you just search that, I'll come up. It has tons of information on there. Sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming when you get there. So if you need help with a place to start, literally just shoot me a DM. I love chatting with people. But I also work with clients within my Raise Your Threshold program. So that is my, program that I've developed over the years, working one-on-one with people who have migraine. And it's a great way to get the information that you need, that you've probably been researching on your own, but need like help and direction and guidance. You also get support from me in that program, and you get community, which is a really powerful health promoting way to go through a program like this. There's a lot of research behind, having a social group involved in your health journey. So you get all of that in my program. And then if you do need, one-on-one support from me, that's also an option as long as you're in an area where I can provide that. But I'm always happy to chat more about that as well. I'm very open to messages and emails and whatever. So send them my way.
Yeah, so it sounds like virtually you can work with anyone, but your physical capacity, like your license is tied to a state. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, so there are certain states where I can practice one-on-one. The list is a little bit lengthy, so it's always available on my website as far as one-on-one support. And then anyone is welcome in my just Raise Your Threshold program as a whole.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Awesome. Well, for the listeners, if any of this resonates with you, please go interact with Kelli, and if nothing else, just follow her on Instagram. And I resonate with everything you're saying. I think it's very reasonable and digestible. No pun intended, or actually pun intended. I did intend it. Yeah, totally. I'm gonna own that. But thank you so much for being on the Headache Doctor podcast. This was a lot of fun. Any final words or nuggets for people?
Last thing is, I think it's really important to remember as you're, starting any journey with health and with nutrition, that food is not just about fuel. It's also about enjoyment and, hanging out with your friends, and about culture. And don't forget that part. Don't make food just this like black and white nutrients only thing. You can also enjoy food. And I think that's a really important part of, all of this as well. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And again, reach out, find Kelli on Instagram, and have your life be changed by her as well.